You wake up one morning and everything is dark. Not the darkness of a room with the curtains drawn. Not the kind that fades when your eyes adjust. This is total, permanent. The world you knew, every face, every trail, every flicker of firelight, gone. For a hunter-gatherer living 50,000 years ago, this moment would have felt like a death sentence. You can't hunt, you can't track, you can't read the landscape for predators. In a world where survival depended entirely on your ability to move, see, and react. Losing your sight should have meant losing everything. Except it didn't. And that is the part nobody talks about. For most of human prehistory, blindness was more common than you might think. And the people who went blind, many of them survived. Some of them thrived. The evidence scattered across ancient burial sites and skeletal remains tells a story that completely overturns everything you assumed about what it meant to be weak in the ancient world. So what actually happened when an ancient human went blind? To understand it, you first need to understand the world they lived in. Your ancestors spent roughly 300,000 years as hunter-gatherers. Small bands of 20 to 50 people moving across landscapes following game and seasonal plants. Anthropologist James Suzman, who spent decades living with the Jew-Huansi Bushmen of the Kalahari, one of the last surviving hunter-gatherer cultures on Earth, described their society as one built almost entirely on interdependence. No one person survived alone. Every individual contributed something. Blindness in the ancient world had many causes. Injury was the most immediate. A thorn, a splinter of bone, a blunt strike to the head during a hunt or a fight. Any of these could destroy vision in one or both eyes. Infections were another major cause. Trachoma, a bacterial infection of the eye caused by the bacterium Chlamydia trachomatis, is one of the oldest recorded diseases in human history. It spreads through contact with infected discharge, through flies, through shared fabrics. In dense hunter-gatherer camps, it moved fast. Left untreated, and your ancestors had no antibiotics, it caused scarring of the cornea and eventually total blindness. The World Health Organization estimates trachoma has blinded or visually impaired over 1.9 million people in the modern world, and the ancient world had no defense against it at all. Cataracts were another reality. As your ancestors aged, and some did age, living well into their 50s and 60s even without modern medicine, the lens of the eye could cloud over. Gradual, progressive, irreversible without surgery. The world would slowly become a blur, then a smear of light, then nothing. So blindness happened. Regularly. Across every culture, every continent, every era of prehistoric life. And here is where the archaeology gets interesting. In 2018, researchers re-examining skeletal remains from the Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan, the same cave where Neanderthal burials had been discovered in the 1950s by archaeologist Ralph Solecki, found something extraordinary. One of the individuals, a Neanderthal known as Shanidar I, had survived for years with a withered arm, a damaged leg, significant hearing loss, and likely partial blindness. His injuries were not fresh. The bones had healed. He had lived with these disabilities for a substantial portion of his adult life. That meant people around him had supported him, fed him, kept him alive. And Shanidar I was not alone. Across dozens of prehistoric sites, archaeologists have found remains of individuals who clearly survived serious debilitating conditions, injuries, chronic illness, skeletal deformities, long past the point where they could have survived without help. Researcher Lorna Tilley, who developed a field called the bioarchaeology of care, has cataloged dozens of such cases spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Her work shows that care for the severely disabled is not a modern invention. It is an ancient human behavior. But survival through the support of others is only part of the story. Because many blind individuals in ancient communities did not simply survive as passive dependents. They contributed. In ways that were invisible to outsiders but absolutely essential to the group. Think about what a blind person can still do. They can listen. Acutely, with a precision that sighted people rarely develop. Anthropological accounts from multiple hunter-gatherer societies describe blind elders who could identify approaching animals by sound alone. The specific rhythm of footfall, the crack of a branch at a particular height, the distant call of a bird that meant danger was near. In a world before written language, where survival knowledge was entirely oral and experiential, a person who had lived for decades and memorized the landscape, the seasons, the behavior of prey, that person was irreplaceable. They could remember. Your ancestors had no books, no maps, no written records. Everything was stored in human memory and passed down through story. A blind elder who had spent 40 years accumulating knowledge about water sources, migration routes, medicinal plants, and the social histories of neighboring groups was a living archive. Losing them was not just a personal loss. It was a community loss of irretrievable information. They could speak, tell stories, teach, mediate disputes. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner, who spent decades studying the Zhu Huanxi people, found that nighttime gatherings around the campfire, what she called firelight talk, were dominated by storytelling, social bonding, and the transmission of cultural knowledge. These were hours of darkness, lit only by the fire. In this context, a blind person was no more disadvantaged than anyone else. The darkness was the equalizer. There is also strong evidence that blindness in ancient cultures sometimes conferred a kind of elevated social status. Across many early human societies, from ancient Mesopotamia to Aboriginal Australian oral traditions to Greek mythology, blind figures appear as seers, prophets, and keepers of sacred knowledge. Tiresias, the blind prophet of ancient Thebes, could see the future, though he could not see the present. This archetype is so consistent across so many unconnected cultures that anthropologists believe it reflects something real. A widespread ancient belief that the loss of physical sight somehow sharpened an inner one. Whether or not you believe in mysticism, the logic is not hard to follow. A blind person in an ancient community, freed from the constant visual demands of hunting and navigation, may have developed exceptional skills in listening, remembering, and interpreting the behavior of the people around them. They became specialists in human dynamics, and in a small group where alliances, trust, and social cohesion meant the difference between surviving a bad winter and not, someone who could read people with extraordinary precision was enormously valuable. The picture that emerges from all of this is not what you might expect. It is not a picture of ancient societies that abandoned the blind on a hillside or drove them from the group. The picture that emerges from the skeletal remains, from the anthropological records, from the comparative study of modern hunter-gatherer societies, is of communities that integrated their blind members, adapted around them, and in many cases found ways to leverage their remaining strengths. That is not to say it was easy. It wasn't. A blind person in a world without walking aids, without paved paths, without stable architecture, without any of the systems we have built to accommodate visual impairment, that person faced genuine danger every day. Falls, predators, disorientation in unfamiliar territory. The risks were real. The world was not designed for them, but neither was it designed to simply let them die. Here is the twist that should change how you think about this. We tend to imagine ancient human life as brutal, zero-sum, and merciless. A world where weakness meant death and only the strongest survived. This is the version of prehistory that became popular in the 19th century, shaped by a particular reading of Darwin that was less about science and more about ideology. Social Darwinism, as it came to be called, projected a competitive, individualistic, survival of the fittest model onto ancient life. But the archaeological and anthropological evidence tells a different story. Your ancestors were not primarily competitors. They were primarily cooperators. The extraordinary success of Homo sapiens as a species, our spread across every continent, our survival through ice ages and volcanic winters, our explosion in population over the past 100,000 years, was not driven by our ability to eliminate the weak. It was driven by our ability to work together, share knowledge, and care for one another across generations. The blind elder who could not hunt, but who remembered where the river ran in the dry season, was not a burden. He was a survival asset. And that reframing matters today. Because when you look at modern society, the way we think about productivity, usefulness, dependency, who counts and who doesn't. You can trace that thinking all the way back to an industrial logic that is, in evolutionary terms, brand new. The idea that your value is measured by your output, your physical capacity, your ability to perform in a competitive marketplace, that idea is historically recent. It is not ancient wisdom, it is modern ideology. Your actual ancient ancestors measured value differently. They measured it in knowledge, in relationships, in the capacity to hold a group together through memory and story and trust. And by that measure, the blind elder sitting by the fire, the one who couldn't see the flames but could tell you exactly where they had last seen water 3 seasons ago, was one of the most valuable people in the group. You wake up one morning and everything is dark. In the ancient world, that was not always the end of your story. Sometimes it was the beginning of a different one.